Revolution. It's when they invented the guillotine. They had a lot of mob violence. It was perhaps one of the first public manifestations of what we today call cancel culture, right? If somebody was pointed out as being not a friend to the revolution without trial or without any kind of public hearing, they were just executed. It was turbulent and it was disruptive. It rocked the very foundations of society. King Louis XVI got his head chopped off. There was political and social unrest. There was religious confusion. And without making too precise of an analogy, I do think there might be a historical analog between the French Revolution and some of the things that are happening in society today. Because at the time of
I'm going to be on a phone call.
The time of the French Revolution, there were what they called three estates or three powers in early modern France, right? There was the clerical state, the religious people. Then there was the ruling class or the nobility. And then they called something like the common class or the working class or the merchant class. These were divisions in society. They were clearly marked in their function. It kind of kept order, but it also perpetuated bias. It was really important back then, the uniform that a person wore. Uniforms today are still really important. But back then, the uniform or the livery that a person wore was going to earmark or demark what they did in society. And as I said, even today, uniforms are important. If some strange person comes up to your front door, you might get nervous. But if they're wearing a brown uniform and they work for United Parcel Service, that identifies who they are. Pilots are identified by their uniforms. Police officers are identified by their uniforms. And in the early modern period, these three powers existed side by side, sometimes in conflict. But the first class was what we call the clerical class. This clerical class went from your parish priest up to the clergy, to the religious men and women, up to the bishops, the spiritual power, and all the way to the Pope in Rome. And the tension between the clerical class in France and the clerical class in Italy was profound and manifold in a lot of different ways. Today, there's still a clerical class. It's shrinking in size and scope. For us Catholics, it goes again from our local parish priest, and then our ordinary, the bishop and the archbishop here, and then the bishops' conference, and then in the larger world, it goes to the Vatican, right? So this class has reduced its size, its scope, its influence to a certain degree. But my first polling question, and trust me, it gives me no joy to ask a question like this, or even to have to ask a question like this, but I'm going to ask it of each of these classes, right? The first question is, in the previous decade, my trust, admiration, and consideration for the religious, clerical, Catholic, Vatican estate or class as a source of multiple moral authority, has it increased? Has it stayed about the same? Or has it decreased and lessened? I'm talking to a bunch of practicing Catholics here. I put myself in that group. I'm a cradle Catholic. I know some of you are converts. I'm very invested in the church and in the life of the church. And if I had to vote, I would probably say that my attitude toward the clerical class, and it hurts me to say this, is probably decreased as a source of moral authority. I see some of the things in the church that I would like changed. I see some of the things in the leadership of the church that I would like changed, but I think it's probably gone down a little bit. I pray every day that it starts to go up, but it's interesting here. We've got 43%. Most of you said it stayed the same. About a third say that it has gone down or it's lessened a little bit. And about 20% say that it has increased. So we can stop that poll, but keep those numbers in mind. Please keep those numbers in mind, because we're going to ask a couple more polls here momentarily. And in fact, the next poll is going to be the poll is the ruling class, right? The political or ruling class. This was the second estate. Back in early modern France, it was the king and the queen, the court and the nobility and the ambassadors. Today, the political or ruling class, as you know, is the elected officials, the lobbyists, the pundits, everything that's been going on in Washington, D.C., the federal government and the ruling class is increasing in size and scope. More people are employed by the federal government, for example, now than ever before in history. The ruling class is on TV 24/7. Lots of things in the last 4 years you've seen. In January this year, a change of administration. So the ruling or political class is still alive. It's still very conspicuous. It's still very much manifest in our culture. So here is my next question. In the previous decade, my trust, polling question, Randy can throw it up here. In the previous decade, my trust, admiration, and consideration for the political or governing or ruling class as a source of moral authority has either increased and deepened, has it stayed about the same, or has it decreased and lessened? As a source of moral authority, when you look at the ruling class, the political class, the lobbyist class, the pundit class, has it increased? Has it decreased? Has it stayed the same? And this is not much of a surprise either. Poll after poll after poll will tell us that 90 to 95% of Americans have lost trust in the governing class. They've lost trust in the ruling class. And whether you're on one side of the issue or the other, it seems like people are having less and less confidence in that ruling class. So we'll stop that poll. And you can see the pattern that we're going to have here, because we're going to go now to the third estate, right? Now, the third estate has changed a little bit in the time from the merchant class. Back then, it was called the common or the working class. It would have been the farmers and the soldiers and the merchants. But in our society today, we are going to include the blue collar, the white collar, the pink collar. In this merchant or business class, it's called the knowledge class. So it's not just people who work with their bodies, right? The farmers and the construction workers, very important to the economy, obviously, but also the knowledge class, the executives, the CEOs. We have a new class of people since the early modern period, the superstar CEO, right? The Jeff Bezos and the Tim Cooks and the Mark Zuckerberg and all of these the Elon Musk's, that merchant class, that business class. We see them dominate the news. They're being called in front of Congress, the Facebook and the Twitter and the TikTok apps. They're looking at them to see if there should be increased or decreased regulation. So the next question, in the previous decade, my trust, and Randy wants to launch this, in the previous decade, my trust, admiration, you can see it's the exact same question, and consideration for the business or laboring class as a source of moral authority. This is what we're going to talk about today. As a source of moral authority, has it again increased and deepened? Has it stayed about the same? Or has it decreased and lessened? Really fascinating data here, right? Because this is the third estate. This was the third group of people, the group of people that the majority of us on this call probably belong to, that third power, that third estate, that merchant class, the business class, the knowledge class, the working class. So we still have 71% has said that it's decreased, about 17% said it's stayed the same. Only 12% say it's deepened their perception of the moral authority of that class. So that's really interesting, because it was at this time during the French Revolution that the fourth estate came into being, right? This fourth estate was the press, the free press. It was supposed to, speak truth to power. It was supposed to be public. It was supposed to be objective, inexpensive. Newspapers shouldn't cost a lot of money, and they were a nickel, and then they were a dime, and then they were a quarter. It should be transparent. It should be accountable, right? You should be able to hold the elected officials accountable. So this fourth estate, the free and open press, continues to grow. It continues to expand. In fact, some historians, economic historians, are actually talking about the fifth estate. That fifth estate would be the blogosphere, the Twittersphere, the social media apps that are outside of the traditional press corps. We saw an example of this maybe with the GameStop, the stocks, the Robinhood, the individual investors were pitted in a very simplistic way against the institutional investors. And I know that it's far more complicated than that and far more interesting than that. But that fourth estate has gone from not existing at all. I wrote one of the first books on the history of printing press and the newspapers and the serial publication. It went from almost zero during the time of Shakespeare to only being recognized by Thomas Carlyle in 1787 to today, the ubiquity of that fourth estate. So you can almost guess what my next polling question is going to be, if Randy would be so kind to launch this next polling question. In the previous decade, again, it's the exact same question, just to the different power or the different estate. My trust, admiration, and consideration for the press, journalistic estate as a source of moral authority has it increased and deepened? Has it stayed about the same? Has it decreased and lessened? Now, again, this is no surprise to me at all, because there are lots of polls out there that are done in this society, and the trust or the esteem with which we hold the conventional press, the news networks, the newspapers, the radio stations, they tell us that it's at an all-time low. They tell us that it's at an all-time low. So we've got lots of evidence. This isn't a scientific poll, but the people on this call, the people on this Zoom call, seem to be suggesting that of those four estates, almost all of them have had significant decreases in what we perceive as moral authority. And even the one that we embrace and invest the most moral authority has even fallen. Not as much as the ruling class or the press or the journalistic class, but this moral authority seems to be on the wane. So what are we supposed to do as a laity? What are we supposed to do with this if we're part of what we call the merchant class, the leadership class, the executive class, the managerial class, the knowledge class? Because I've done a deep dive. We're just in the final stages of this book on Omobono. It's been a lot more complicated than we initially thought. So those of you who are wondering how come that book isn't out yet, we apologize. We still have one more trip back to Rome to consult an archive that has been obviously postponed. But one of the things that I've been doing in my part of the book is to look at how merchants, how the business class, how the entrepreneurial class has been depicted in literature and in film and in art, right? How have the class of people who go about day to day involve them in negotium, right? The odium negotium, classical distinction between the active life and the contemplative life. That active life, that negotium, people who are about negotiating. And I looked at Shakespeare, for example, the Merchant of Venice, where Antonio begins the play, I know not why I'm so sad, because I have a lot of money, but money hasn't made me happy. All of the books of Charles Dickens, look at how the merchants are treated in Dickens or in Orwell, and the novels, the movies. I defy you to go out and find a movie that depicts in the last 30 years, that depicts a business leader, a business owner, somebody who's engaged in commercial activity, someone who has employees that is treated with dignity and respect, right? So we remember from 1987, this movie, Wall Street, and Gordon Gekko and Greed is Good. An entire generation of people equated the work of commerce and industry with the greediness of corporate America and the Wall Street traders and the subprime lenders, right? And I've always thought that that was unfair, because in my experience, my dad was a small business owner. My brother's a small business owner. I know so many people on this call work in business, and they seem to be good and decent people, hardworking, love their families, pay their taxes. But yet that merchant class seems to have been either dismissed by the movies or the artists as not really that interesting, a necessary evil. But it's very rare to see in the history of in the fictive imagination where somebody conceives of a person in the realm of the merchant class, the entrepreneurial class, or the business class as having dignity or value. This we can see through our own history all over the place, like the Carnegies and the Rockefellers and the Morgans. Now, certainly they were people of extraordinary wealth, and they got a lot of criticism and provoked a lot of envy. But the amount of money that these men gave away, Carnegie started over 1,500 libraries, and the philanthropy of Rockefeller and J.P. Morgan and Cornelius Vanderbilt, these people that were called the robber barons or the industrialists, had great wealth. And today you see, the Bill Gateses of the world, where he's decided to give, he's pledged to give at least half of his wealth away in billionaires have pledged to give most of their money away. And so there's a really interesting tension here. There's a really interesting recognition that some things that are happening are moving in a way that they can reclaim their moral authority. But these folks right here, wow, they are in the center of it right now, right? They might be called in front of Congress. They've already been called in. Are they too powerful? Are we going to break them up? I think Amazon has 250,000 employees, something like that. Just an enormous amount of people working for Amazon. We see their trucks, but and Bezos obviously was on the front page of the news yesterday or the day before because he's retiring as CEO. He's going to stay on as chairman. But these are what I mean when I talk about superstar CEOs and this sort of thing. And business itself is being really politicized. This is Ludwig von Mises, one of the great Catholic economists, the founder of the Viennese School of Economic Theory. And he complained 100 years ago that the mixing of politics and business not only is detrimental to politics, but it's frequently observed much more so to business. And on the front page of the Wall Street Journal today, there were talks about, well, what should the corporate tax rate be? Should we raise the minimum wage? How much profit is too much profit? What are the environmental regulations people ought to follow? How about the social media platforms? Are some of these companies too big, the monopolies? And of course, everybody's been talking about the stock prices, the day traders, the Robin Hoods. So the world of the political world of business is fraught with tension and with danger. And largely the Bishops' Conference stays out of it because they think that the practice of business falls outside of the scope of faith and morals. But as you know, I disagree with that. I think our business life falls right down Main Street of faith and morals. In fact, our faith and morals might be tested more in any other sphere in our life in business, because it's pretty clear how you're supposed to treat your spouse. It's pretty clear how you're supposed to treat your God. But the world of business, sometimes well, it's the cost of doing business. Everybody does this. I can fudge this. I can erase this line. I can move to this line in order to be competitive. So it's kind of hard without examples, without concrete, specific examples, without guidelines, without support groups, because the world is kind of changing. The world is in a disruptive state, and it is a bit of an upheaval. So I tried to find out the moment when business became treated as a morally serious undertaking, right? When did Catholic thinkers especially start linking business and their faith? When did business leaders start saying, what is it about my faith, the animating principles of my faith that gives me my ethics, my lodestar of behavior, the disciplines and pieties of life? Because we as Catholics know that, for example, marriage is a morally serious endeavor. We understand that there's a certain sacramentality when it comes to marriage and the guidelines of how we are supposed to enter into that sacramental union. But it's only been since, as far as I can tell, 1996, when Michael Novak came out with this book. So this is this isn't that long ago. And many of you have read this book, but the title of it was really jarring in 1996. It won a lot of awards. Some people actually poked a little fun at him because he used the word vocation or calling in the same sentence as business. But those of you who run your own company, those of you who work in a company, those of you who strive every day for that synthesis between the integrated life, as Randy Hain calls it, right? It is a morally serious endeavor. So what are we supposed to do, and how are we supposed to look at the way in which faith informs and guides our business? Because if it is an examined life, and if we are going to try and emulate those moments of heroic virtue, what are we going to look for? So this was, I think, one of the very first books that brought it into high relief. And then there was a document that came out in 1999. Again, when I started doing research on St. Omobono, there was nothing in English published on the guy. There wasn't a thing at all published on St. Omobono. My article that came out in 2019 in the Acton Institute Journal of the Market and Morals and Market was one of the first. I'm not bragging, I'm just saying very few people had ever heard of the St. Omobono because the English translations weren't done yet. But in 1999, then St. John Paul II went to Cremona in Italy and came up with a document of an apostolic blessing, and he declared it for that diocese the year of St. Omobono. Found this document. It was only translated into Italian and into Latin in 1999. This is the uncorrupt body of St. Omobono underneath the high altar in the Duomo of Cremona. I can't wait to get back there. My heart hurts that I haven't been to Italy in over a year and a half. The uncorrupt body 800 years later is still under the Duomo. And he pointed out a couple of things. He said that St. Omobono, believe it or not, is the only lay person, the only member of the third estate to be canonized in the entirety of the Middle Ages. So if we're looking for a model of heroic virtue, and we are part of that third estate, St. Omobono was the only lay person over a period of 300 to 400 years that the church canonized that was a member of the working class or the merchant class or the entrepreneur class. And St. John Paul called him at that time a saint for our time, actually. He said there are striking parallels, believe it or not, between 1199, and this was 1999, right? So we had 1199 and 1999. It was the 800th year of his canonization. John Paul declared it the year of Omobono for the diocese of Cremona. He said, St. Omobono is our contemporary. Think about that. Our contemporary. The Pope said he is our contemporary. So it begs the question, what is it about him that makes him our contemporary? Why is he a saint for a time when there's disruption or uncertainty, or there's a certain decrease in the moral authority of the four different classes or estates or powers? What can this person tell us? Well, St. Omobono is indeed, as Randy said, the patron saint of business. He's the patron saint of merchants. He's the patron saint of entrepreneurs. And his name, of course, was a very common first name. Vivaldi, Stradivarius, who's from Cremona. That's where he made the violins. He had a son named St. Omobono. And it literally means good man. And for those of you who know the story, he died in 1197, and 2 years later, he was made a saint. This was very quick, very rapid, and it happened under the reign of Innocent III. He's still venerated in Cremona today. They still have the what they call the cult of St. Omobono. He's available on the frescoes in the various churches. There is the first cover of the first sarcophagus that Omobono, after he died, he was placed in this burial chamber first, and then 2 years later moved to the Duomo. He's still an active saint. When I was there the last time, I was going through an old antique store, and I found a little medallion with St. Omobono on it, and it was cast about 100 years ago. So they still use his image and his likeness, and they still pray to him. This is the cathedral in Cremona, and it's got a beautiful bell tower next to it. I don't know, was it 131, 132 steps to the top? You get a beautiful view of the Umbrian Valley. You can see the baptistry right next to it. But his life was told in these four documents. So the bull of canonization, and then cum orbitus solus, and then 30 years later, there was a Conian Historiae, and then, it should be 1260, 1260. And then about 60 years after he died, the last one came in and put them all together. And these documents were in fragments, and they were, as I suggested, had never been translated into English. A new biography of the saint came out last year, and that's another reason it delayed us a little bit, but it was entirely in French. Well, my French is close to non-existent, so my co-author, Don Prudhoe, read through the entire biography, and the good news, at least from our perspective, is he didn't uncover or steal any of our thunder, this sort of thing, but it's a very important biography that will have to be incorporated into our work. But that's the four documents of his life that had to be translated. They had never been converted because his feast day is in November, and the Acta Santa is only through March or April right now, so they might not get to that translation for 100 years. On the top of the church in Cremona, they do have the picture of St. Omobono. And he, in his first documents, it's really interesting. The first documents almost never mentioned his life as a merchant. It was almost as if they were not necessarily embarrassed by it, but that's not what they were trying to emphasize up front that his merchant, in fact, one of the very first things that they said, he did not frequent the company of worldly men, among whom he was distinguished like a lily among the thorns. And of course, those thorns are the thorns of the marketplace. Those thorns were the thorns of the business world, because in the medieval period, the realm of business was considered a lower state than the clerical class, right? We had the first estate, the second estate, the third estate. And so it was of a lower order. So what they were trying to do is emphasize his piety, his holiness, his daily activities of lauds and matins, the kind of daily rituals and observances that we would use, saying the rosary, the angelus, examination of conscience. He was doing all of those to help him during the times that he had to go into the field of thorns. But the document gets really interesting, maybe from the second sentence, because the second sentence of the bull of canonization says, it is difficult for one who practices business, i.e., the person who owns a business, the entrepreneur, the merchant, someone who works in a business, to divest him or herself of religious indifference. It's really hard to maintain a vibrant religious prayer life for a lot of people who are so busily engaged in work. So when he died in 1197, the spontaneous act of veneration, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people spontaneously came to Cremona to pay their respects to the dead Saint Omobono, or at this time, just Omobono. And the bishop wrote to Pope Innocent III and said, wow, we have something going on here that's very special. This guy is holy. We think that you ought to make him a saint. And Innocent III at this time said, no, the virtue of his popularity is only one sign of his holiness. We now need to get a divine signification to make sure that his holiness is genuine. Therefore, we need 2 miracles. It was the first time ever that a pope required 2 miracles before a person could be inscribed into the litany of saints. So he sent out investigators, and after taking testimony from dozens and dozens and dozens of people, they came back with a list of 16 or 17 miracles, and Innocent was stunned, and they made him a saint in 1199. Well, in that next document, they were talking about how important it was to stay local, how important it was to get holy and to not worry about the large things that are happening. And my son and I had this conversation recently. When you get a little overwhelmed by all the stuff that might be happening in the Vatican or the stuff that might be happening in the bishops' conference, his advice and my advice, and it makes good sense, is to stay local, stay with the sacraments, stay with the Eucharist, do the daily acts of your family life every single day. And by this, he was, quote unquote, listen to this phrase, saved from the perverse and miserable practices of the market. So even here, the church recognizes the possibility of the market, the free market, the unintended or unregulated free market, to maybe corrupt or to maybe unmoor somebody from their spiritual foundations. The cost of doing business, that's a phrase that we've all said, well, the cost of doing business. These documents almost suggest that the cost of doing business might be an adverse impact on your soul. And if that's the case, that's very interesting. And that's why St. Omobono is a saint for our time, because he wouldn't let that happen. They even describe business in these documents as a grindstone. They talked about his financial pressure, his family pressures, his social pressures. He wanted to give more and more of his money away. And his wife said, no, we need the money for ourselves. And I want to have the certain quality of life. And I want to have the certain clothing that I wear. And they finally came up with an agreement that he could use the land outside of Cremona to grow the grapes, to press into the juice, to turn into wine, to sell the wine, to give that money away to the poor. So that's why he's the patron saint of entrepreneurs, because he found another, what we would call today, another revenue stream. And then that revenue stream was converted to almsgiving and charitable costs, or charitable practices, because, quote unquote, his formerly callous preoccupation with increasing his wealth began to cool. He had, I guess, what we would call today a midlife crisis, or he wanted to switch to doing something that he considered to have more meaning or more significance. Instead of gaining, he wanted to give. We see this over and over with people who at a certain stage in their life, they they transition or they move, and whether it's while they're still working or in retirement into a different area where they can contribute through St. Vincent de Paul or through different charitable organizations, these sorts of things. And we're blessed in the Catholic Church to have so many of these philanthropic opportunities to go out and do some of these things, right? And he called business as a grindstone. So here's the polling question number 5 that we want to ask, and then we'll open it up for some Q&A here, because this pandemic, this disruption, this election, this unrest, whatever you want to call 2020, has created enormous challenges in both professional and personal life. In terms of my faith life, the pandemic has it increased your sense of isolation and spiritual stagnation? Has it decreased my sense of isolation and spiritual stagnation? Or has it had little impact on my own faith practice? I find this a very interesting question. I ask a lot of my friends, because for me, it's maybe been a combination of all 3 of those from one time or another, because as Randy said earlier, there are some advantages to Zoom. I don't have to go into faculty meetings ever again. English department faculty meetings, you want my definition of purgatory. You attend an English department faculty meeting in person. Now I can just put it on Zoom, and I can put it on mute, and I can listen. I can still get everything that I need to hear. On Tuesday, it was my birthday. It was the feast of the presentation of the Lord. It was the candle mass. I pulled up the mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral. It was really easy for me to do it, and I was able to have a mass that day. But on the other hand, boy, getting to church, it was closed for a while. The reservation system, the inability to worship closely, and the masks, I can see where that could also lead to a sense of stagnation. On February 2nd, my birthday was also Groundhog Day, right? And it's one of my favorite movies. And I talk to people who say that they feel like they're in Groundhog Day right now, that they're just kind of on this loop over and over and over and over. And what are we supposed to do? So I think these results are pretty fascinating. And I agree with Randy. One of the things that we can do as a community, one of the things we can do as a community of Catholics, as a community of business leaders and people who are in the realm of business, is we can share, we can talk, we can pray with one another, we can look at best practice and say, hey, how are you doing? Because I mean, this thing knocked me for a loop, right? A couple of my kids had it, my parents had COVID. I lost 95% of my business. I wasn't teaching anymore. It took me some time to find my sea legs in this, and it got very confusing, and it was a little uncertain and a little scary when your parents have COVID and your son is knocked down, and another son is suffering from it, and by the grace of God, some of the others didn't. And my son is at St. Pius, and boy, they've had cases, and you can see why the tension of the last year might have a problem with your faith life, or your sense of isolation, your sense of despair. And so that's one of the reasons we do this. And I'm grateful for Randy for putting this together, and for people to get out there and to strive. And hopefully we're all 1 or 2 shots away from rejoining our life as it was, and joining our faith community and this sort of thing. And Randy asked me always to put some readings together, or some possible reading. The good news is that the church is now taking seriously the emphasis upon the business life, the possibility of sanctification in the business life, the meaning of business, the quest for Catholic business leaders to look for guidance and models of virtue. The dean of the Catholic University of America came up with a catechism for business, tough ethical questions and insights from the Catholic teachings. There's a Force for Good, the Catholic Guide to Business Integrity. I just read that. Chris Lowney, Randy's hosted him before. There's an article on St. Omobono. Randy's got 5 or 6 books, but the Catholic Briefcase is excellent. The Acton Institute, The Good That Business Does, this little pamphlet talking about how markets and how capital and access to market and capital will just open up and help all boats rise, and to show the wonderful opportunities that the business community has given to underserved markets throughout the world. And obviously the virtuous leadership vocation of a business leader. I already talked about Michael Novak's Michael Novak's book. So there's lots of resources out there for people if they need some kind of edification, some kind of deep reading into the way that you can integrate your faith and your personal life. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Randy, and we're going to open it up for a little Q&A. I hope with the polling questions and the data, it might give you something to reflect on, and we might have time for some questions here.
Paul, thank you so much. That was very illuminating and excellent, just wonderful stuff. I want to invite everybody to put your questions into the chat box, and I will read them out to Dr. Voss. Paul, as everyone's kind of preparing their thoughts and questions, I've got one for you. As you think about where we are at this place in time, I mean, it was so interesting to learn about Saint Omobono and his life. And if you think about one of the specific virtues that you would call out from his life that you think is applicable for us today that we really need to emulate, is there one that comes to mind that's your favorite? One specific aspect of his life that you want to really push today?
Yeah, the perseverance, right? He just kept going. He had this epiphany at about the age of 50. He lived to be 80, but his heroic virtue consisted in his fidelity and his faithful perseverance of the practices, the daily practices of the faith. He continued to place that first and foremost. He continued to do the things that the morning prayers, the daily communion, the examination of conscience, these sorts of things. There's lots of them. You don't have to do all of those. A simple rosary, the Angelus, but what he did is he persevered, and because he was a lay person in the 12th century, of course he faced challenges and heartaches and children, wonderful, right? The greatest blessing in the world, but there are also a mixed blessing at times, right? The concern that you have for the children and their health and their well-being. He continued to persevere. And the thing that gives me great solace is when I see successful men and women who have maintained their Catholic identity and they have had business success, I go, wow, it's possible. There are people out there, 50 of them on this call this morning, who have done it, and they give us a model. And if they can do it, I can do it. And if I can do it, you can do it. That sense of community and perseverance was striking in these documents, that it showed his fidelity to the small pieties of the faith and the practice of his Catholicism.
Thank you. Thank you. There's questions are starting to come in, Paul. So from Bill Jagrowski, as always, thanks for the presentation, Dr. Voss. In addition to the resources you shared, I'm curious if there is an opportunity to engage with the conscious capitalism movement, which highlights the benefits of business to society while emphasizing the need for moral and ethical behavior among business leaders.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. There are about 3 of these movements out there, conscious capitalism. There's one called moral capitalism. It comes out of St. Paul. Stephen Wright, I believe is his name. And I've had conversations with these people, not that look, anybody can have conversations with these people. You can just call them up and ask them. That's one of the problems. One of the great strengths of our church is that we have, hundreds and hundreds of dioceses and wonderful people doing things in Dallas and Denver and Atlanta and all these small pockets of people getting together. One of the things that we don't have is a lot of communion between and among those dioceses. And so what some of the people are doing in Dallas or Denver are duplicative of what we're doing here in Atlanta. And if we could find a way to link some of these things up, that would be fascinating, and that would be fabulous. So we don't have to have parallel activities. I recently gave a talk to a group, I think it's called Young Catholics Professionals, Young Professional Catholics. Maybe Randy knows the name of it, but it started in Dallas, and they already had 75 or 85 young professionals. Most of them were in their 20s, a few of them in their early 30s. They showed up at the Holy Spirit Catholic Church. Yeah, yes, it was networking, but it was people who want to take their faith seriously. I thought, gosh, if we could just harness some of these people and link them up with the stuff that Bill Jagrowski's doing with Catholic Charities, leadership class, really, really good. And, and all the things that you people are involved in. Yeah, no, there's there's a great opportunity for synergy. It escapes me on how we're going to synthesize all that, but geez, there's a lot of good stuff out there. You're absolutely right.
Paul, if you don't mind, the next question is kind of specific to the Roswell area. Lisa asks, are there Catholic business groups in Roswell? Lisa, let me respond to that if you don't mind. We had a very vibrant Faith at Work ministry at St. Peter Chanel for many years. And just because we got distracted and focused on other things, we haven't really done much with it for the past year. I'm going to go out on a limb now, and hopefully Deacon Mike won't shoot me, but I think what we've been doing, again, pandemic induced, is I think we have sort of rediscovered a passion for faith at work and integrating faith at work. And these Zoom sessions we're doing may be the start of what will become the Faith at Work ministry again. Maybe we'll do it virtually and get together later. One thing I would ask everyone, if you are interested, I've got the email addresses of many of you, but if you are interested in just being part of articles, invitations to conversations like this with Dr. Voss, please email me at rhain@serviam partners.com. That's serviumpartners.com. And just let me know if you have an interest. So Lisa, we will, I think we're all incentivized and excited about what we're seeing from interest levels. So we will probably do something very soon. Thanks for your question. Paul, Jim Hilly has a question for you.
Hi,
What
Jim.
are some daily faith practices that you can recommend that will help us persevere through our current situations?
Yeah, listen, it's an abundance of riches. I know Randy has been kind enough a couple of times, even the last couple of months. He says, I'm saying my daily rosary right now, and I'm offering up for you. I'm offering up for your family. A daily mass online is, 23, 24 minutes. There's all kinds of them out there. There's a Magnificat that you can do a morning reading of spirit. Is something as easy as saying the Angelus and the prayer of Saint Michael the Archangel at 12:15. Listen, there's just so many. You have to kind of figure out which one suits you and your routine, and like anything else, like Weight Watchers or physical exercise, spiritual exercise requires a discipline. Spiritual exercise requires a routine. It requires the day-to-day showing up. It's what the Opus Dei people sometimes call the heroic minute, right? That minute in the morning when that alarm clock goes off at 5:45 rather than 6. Do you hit snooze and wait till 6, or do you get up at 5:45? I love that notion of the heroic minute, where you actually decide that day at that time if you're going to get your morning offering in, or if you're not going to get your morning offering, or you're going to get your prayers in. So, Jim, listen, there's a lot of them, and the practice of the church goes back centuries. Find the one which you think is most amenable to you, and the diet and the exercise that is most amenable to your soul. And I encourage you to pursue it wholeheartedly.
Paul, we've got a question from John Riordan, our co-host this morning.
Hi, John, and a financial supporter of my book. Thank you, John. I really appreciated that, and it'll pay off once this book is done for you. Get a free copy.
So, Dr. Voss, great talk as always. I'm curious, what are some of your sources for inspiration and guidance to increase virtue?
Yeah, well, as you know, John, I have 5 children, and you tend to vicariously live your life through children, and without getting in. So here's a source of inspiration. My son and his wife are pregnant, and the baby has a name. The baby has a personality. And 2 weeks ago, we find out that the baby's not growing. The baby is in less than 1% of all babies, and things are really looking dire. And there's a source of inspiration right there. There's storming the gates of heaven with prayer, right? This is not anything that we would have thought about 6 months ago. Who's the patron saint of maternity? How are we going to figure this out? Thankfully, we got some good news yesterday. The baby went from 1% to 3%. Many of the scariest things have kind of been ruled out with some tests. But from the first shocking news that you're having your first grandchild to the joy of finding out that it's a baby boy, and then to find out that the baby might not make it or be seriously in peril. I mean, life is a roller coaster, right? And so that is a source of inspiration, and a daughter who just got a job is a source of gratitude, and a son who is applying to law schools is both a source of excitement and frustration, and we've been through all of it. So I continually see my family as that source. It continually surprises me, it continually challenges me, and when something comes up, our default is the same. Let's find out who gives us models of heroic virtue here. How are we going to handle this? How can we possibly move forward? What are some of the tools at our disposal to help make sense of this? And it requires blood, sweat, toil, and tears, but it requires constant attention. And my wife is such a good role model. I mean, she does the rosary every day. She does the Magnificat every day. She does her evening prayers. And if I forget and I see her, I can join in. And no, it's never easy. Just like working out is never easy, but it's easier once you get in the rhythm and the routine of working out and going to the gym or eating healthy. And the prayer life and the spiritual life is the same way. So I'm sure, like you, John, a lot of it is the function of my children, my parents, who just celebrated their 63rd wedding anniversary, and those moments in life that continue to animate and inspire me.
Paul, we've had a comment and some encouragement. AJ just wanted to let you know that he and his wife are in the same boat, and they will pray for your family and children.
Thank you, AJ.
Also, Chris Cederlin had asked a question. I just want to mention it to everyone. He was curious if there were LinkedIn groups that you could join that will help us reinforce faith at work. And there are two that specifically come to mind. We have the Atlanta Catholic Business Conference group with about 1,500 members. So if you go into groups and look up Atlanta Catholic Business Conference, we have almost daily article posts, events like this. If you want to be in a rich community of Catholic business people in the Atlanta area, it's an ideal resource. I also would recommend the Catholic Charities Leadership Class group on LinkedIn. It's another source for material, but it's also a great group to either join as a mentor for young Catholic professionals, or you may want to be a mentee yourself and join the group. Question for you, Paul, from David McCullough.
Hi, David.
Paul, another fantastic talk. Thank you. You always take our Catholic history and make it relevant today. Are there Catholic business leaders in today's business environment that you look to as a source of content and examples of heroic virtue?
And by the way, David, thank you. Your I think it was your mother's charity foundation, an academic foundation, a grant-giving organization that supports Christian scholars. And we were able to use a grant from that foundation to get us to Italy the first time to look at some of these manuscripts. So that was, well, listen, the people that I do in the Catholic business community are the people that Randy have mentioned, and you included, right? That Catholic Business Association, the Catholic business leaders. So when I hear that, even when I hear, back in the day, our current Pope criticized capitalism and criticized the profit motive, I always kind of shook my head, because I think of people like, Phil Nagel, a dear friend, a Catholic business leader who quietly gives away his time, his talent, his resources every single day, giving money to important hospitals and charities and to the clergy, and the kind of investment that he's made. I worked really closely with Tom Clements for 5 years as he was trying to start Southern Catholic College. Here's a guy who, sold a company, made a few $1 million, and could have bought a place on the beach and lived there the rest of his life, but he wanted to reinvest. And even though the school finally didn't survive the virtue that took, and the depth of the faith commitment that took, and I consider him a friend and a role model, because he never took the money and ran, right? He said, this is God's money. I'm going to be a good steward of these resources. So and a little confession here, I'm not on Facebook or Twitter or Instagram or Snap. I do no social media. I do have a presence on LinkedIn. I very rarely check it or things like that. But That's the one way that I try and avoid the doom scrolling and the conspiracy theories and the torrential outpouring of bile and vitriol. And so I try to kind of put myself off in a little bit of a secluded area in the social media regards. I still read widely, and we don't have a TV, so I don't see the network news and that sort of thing. But I'm constantly aware of when I do go on to newadvent.com or the Integrated Catholic Life, looking at those stories, and you will see lots of profiles of men and women of business who have Legatus, for example, the Legatus magazine, who give back and who are working in their faith to try and improve parishioners. Patrick Lencioni's started a program, as you know, a couple of years ago to help parishes at the local level reanimate themselves. So there's a lot of good stuff going on out there. I don't want to be a Debbie Downer today, but there's so much good stuff that out there that sometimes the bad stuff is overwhelming, but you have to focus on the positive stuff that's happening in the church as well.
Paul, we have a question from Prescott Carutis. What are your next steps in your faith journey? When you kind of think about your own spiritual growth, what's ahead for you? What are you focused on?
Well, it's interesting. So I have a 28-year-old son who's a very bright guy, and we spend a lot of time talking about this. And I perhaps vented to him a little too much about a certain amount of despair that I had with some of the, when you go to Rome as often as I did, I'm not saying I have inside baseball or anything, but you sometimes see how the sausage is made, or you sometimes see how the decisions are made, and it kind of leaves you maybe a little less enthralled. And my daughter's got a boyfriend, and I think they're probably going to get married. And I'm talking to him about the Catholic Church, and it's a harder sell today than it was 20 years ago for people who are outside the faith, and because they've got 4 or 5 questions about, well, what about this? What about this? What about, and they're all the bad things that the press has turned out. So my long-term goal is just to, and I said this to my son the other day, I'm just going to double down on my faith. I'm going to work twice as hard for those people in my family who have probably given up, or who don't have the faith, and who are questioning and maybe on the margins. I'm just going to have to try and double down and try and be a person of more prayer and more integrity and more compassion. And that's what the laity is called to do. Listen, the point of today's talk was we're the third estate. We need to get this right, because the other estates, you voted on the other estates, and you said that you didn't see them as a source of moral authority. Well, then we have to be. We are the ones that this group and the people who are committed to lives of moral virtue and life's a life of, the Catholic intellectual tradition. We all have to double down. We all have to be better tomorrow than we were today, and that's a big order. So I am going to try and commit myself to being that passage in the gospel where Jesus says to the disciples, they've been fishing all night, right? This is one of John Paul in 1999, he said, I just finished the Holy Year. I'm in my 80th year. I've done 20 years as a pope, because now it's time to get serious. It was just a beautiful document. And he called it Duke and Altum. Throw the nets farther. He goes, throw the nets on the other side of the boat over there. And they looked at it like, who is this guy? We've been out here fishing all night. We caught nothing. And he wants us to throw the nets out one more time, deeper and farther on the other side of the boat. And they got the largest harvest they ever had. And it's hard to Duke and Altum, to go higher and farther. But that's what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to set my goal to try and go farther and higher with that net by deepening and doubling down on my own faith practices. But that's the challenge I have for 2021.
Paul, 3 more questions have come in from Spencer Mitchell. Which, if any, of our business schools are engaging in research or curriculum around faith in business?
Yeah, well, the good news is that they're starting to, right? So the Bush School of Business, Tim Bush gave $25 million to Catholic U, I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago, and got the school named after him. They hired a lot of people. Some of them are Randy's friends. What's the guy who was the papal guard?
Andreas Widmer.
Yeah, Andreas Widmer is up there, and Abila's up there, and they've got some really good people. The University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota. Michael Naughton, I think, has been down here. I think Randy invited him to come down here. They are doing stuff at their School of Business that integrates the faith life, and the Catholic studies programs are proliferating around around the university level at those schools. And it takes some time to ramp up. But the good news is they're starting to take it seriously and starting to put out some high quality work. And they have conferences. Now this last year, everything's been knocked a little off kilter, but it's happening.
Paul, one thing I'd like to just reiterate that you've already mentioned is in your further reading, A Catechism for Business, which Abila was co-author of, is a wonderful resource. I mean, it takes all Catholic teaching, the catechism, any references, quotes, anything that is relevant for business, it is organized and categorized for you. It's a wonderful read, a very good resource. So I have it, and I highly recommend people get it. Sarah Fitzgerald has a question. What are some of the most common pitfalls that you've seen Catholic business leaders stumble over? Maybe some moral issues, conflicts that are common. And what is your advice for us to maintain vigilance against them?
Yeah, there was an article and it wasn't just pertaining to Catholics. It was in the Harvard Business Review, September 2018. It was called Happiness Traps. What happens at work, how we sabotage ourselves at work. And it went through the 4 common happiness traps. And one of them, and it applies to a lot of us, is the I will be happy when trap. We convince ourselves that I will be happy once I do this. I will be happy once I do this. If I get this promotion, if I close this deal, if I have this second home. And that's a fool's trap, right? That's a fool's errand, because that's not how happiness works. There is no I will be happy when. We're never going to get to that point where we finally just raise our hands. Well, all of my needs and hopes and goals have been accomplished, so I'm just going to mail it in now. I'm finished and done. So comparisons are odious, and this is why the Facebook can be so insidious, right? Because it forces you to compare your life to somebody else's life. And remember, these lives are always curated, right? These lives are always presented as in the best possible fashion. And so it's only a glimmer or a slice of the life that you're getting, but that I will be happy when is fairly pernicious. And if you could uproot that, if that's something that afflicts you, if you could get rid of that, I think that's a good start, because it gives you a certain peace of mind that it's not a competition. You are not in competition with any keeping up with the Joneses, as they used to say. The I will be happy when, because the happiness is going to have to be internal. It can't be something that's an external stimulus anyway. Just like salvation can't be external. It has to be an internal status of the ontological status of your immortal soul, as they say, right? So that was the most common trap, the most common happiness trap that I've seen in my life and in business.
Paul, we may end on this question, but Melissa asked, she would love to know about what artwork is hanging on your walls. She's been observing some of the beautiful work around you. She'd like to hear a little bit about what it is and how you chose it.
Oh, well, in that room over there, I have a Caravaggio. I have the Caravaggio, the famous Caravaggio. Well, Christ goes in and he calls St. Matthew, right? I call it the interruption, because imagine Matthew. He's a tax collector. He's in the house counting the money. And Jesus comes in and he just points at Matthew. And Matthew goes, what, me? He goes, yes, you. Follow me. And Matthew immediately gets up and walks out of the room, right? So I call it the interruption, and I have it hanging so that I sit in the same place for dinner and lunch every day. So I'm the only one who can see it directly, because to me, Christianity is a lot like that. It's an interruption. Someone coming in, someone coming over here, a low birth weight baby. There are all these interruptions that we have to deal with as Christians, continually have to deal with as Christians. And that gives me a model. I've got the School of Athens over there, but the one directly behind me is by Verrocchio. And I got it the day my mentor died. My mentor, Stan Stewart, was a man of dignity and intelligence, and he directed my dissertation. And I really love Stan Stewart. And he, your parents have to support you, and your children have to say nice things about you. He was an unabashed supporter of me, and he didn't even have to be. He was a really true mentor in every sense of the word. And that painting in the back is when St. Augustine hears of the death of his own mentor. St. Augustine was straddling the line between the secular world and the religious world. You can see in his library there, he's painting, he's transcribing the Bible, He's got 1 foot in the city of man and 1 foot in the city of God. Years in the wind that Ambrose has died. And it was his mentor, it was his friend. And he continued to carry on in a dignified way, pursuing the intellectual life with some integrity. I've got St. Thomas More here, and I've got Vermeer's Girl of Pearl there. So I didn't mean that to be a distraction. I'm sorry, but we're great lovers of art, and nothing is better for me than an afternoon in Rome in the libraries and the museums talking about and looking at art. So for very little money, you can get these reproductions that are pretty high quality for not much money. You can bring some of that beauty, that joy into your life, and that's kind of what we try to do in my office here.
Paul, thank you. And I just want to remind everyone 2 things. Dr. Voss has graciously agreed to let us share the deck with everyone, so I'll be doing that. Also, the session was recorded. So here's what I'd like you to think about. If you have received an email from me, that means you're on the RSVP list. Some people, though, got into the call through referrals, recommendations, which is great. So if you're not on a list and you've not received an email from me, look at my email in the chat box. I shared it earlier. Send me a request for the deck and the recording, and I'll make sure that you get it. But I just want to, thank on behalf of John Riordan and Deacon Mike. I want to thank Paul for just another amazing conversation. What a great way to start a day. And we're just grateful for your time and the gift of your knowledge and inspiring us in the faith with this great saint. Thank you.
Well, my pleasure. God bless you all today.
All right. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. We will be doing more of this in the future. So again, thanks for your participation.